The first thing my son-in-law ever said to me was, "Sit down, old man, the adults are talking." Nobody at that dinner table moved. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Somewhere in the kitchen, the faucet Emily had forgotten to shut off kept dripping into the sink, one slow drop after another, the only sound in a room where 12 people had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. My son-in-law smiled at his own joke like he'd earned applause. I set my fork down very quietly. I was 61 years old, and I had spent 34 of those years building locks that stopped men far more dangerous than Derek Cole from getting what they wanted. He looked at me the way you look at a stray dog that wandered too close to the porch, something to be tolerated, not respected. That was 8 my daughter called me at 11 at night, crying so hard I could barely make out the words. "Dad," she said. "Dad, please, don't open the garage. I want to back up because you need to understand exactly who Derek Cole thought he was dealing with. I'm Walter Briggs. For 3 decades, I ran a security consulting business out of a converted machine shop in the same town where I raised my daughter, high-end locks, vault mechanisms, access systems for banks and private collectors who couldn't afford to trust anyone. I built the kind of doors that don't open unless you know something nobody thought to ask you. I sold the business 2 years before this all started. I thought I was done. I thought the rest of my life was going to be coffee on the porch and grandkids who didn't exist yet. Derek Cole made sure that plan didn't survive. Emily married him 18 months before that dinner. She met him at a real estate closing. He sold luxury properties to people who liked the word exclusive printed on business cards. He was handsome in the particular way that makes people forget to ask follow-up questions. He drove a car that cost more than my house, and from the very first time I shook his hand, something in the back of my skull, something built over 3 decades of reading men who lie for a living, told me this one wasn't what he was selling. I didn't say anything. You don't get to tell your grown daughter who to love. You just watch, and you wait, and you keep the porch light on. The dinner where he told me to sit down was Emily's birthday. I'd driven 40 minutes with a cake she used to love as a kid, lemon with the raspberry filling. Because some things a father just remembers. Derek had taken over hosting it at their new house, the house I'd actually helped Emily and her mother pick out, years before her mother passed, the house I still, technically, held a lien on until the mortgage transferred cleanly the year before. He stood at the head of that table like he'd built it with his bare hands. When I offered a toast to my daughter, he cut me off before I finished the second sentence. "Sit down, old man. The adults are talking." The room went dead silent except for that dripping faucet. My own daughter stared at her plate. I sat down. I didn't make a scene. But something in me filed that moment away in a place I keep for people I will eventually need to remember clearly. Over the following months, Derek Cole tightened his grip on that house, one small cruelty at a time. He changed the locks on every exterior door within a week of moving in. I only found out because Emily mentioned it in passing, laughing it off as just Derek being careful with the business. He installed cameras aimed at the driveway, at the mailbox, at the garden gate. He told Emily her allowance from her own inheritance, money her mother had left specifically for her, money he had no legal claim to whatsoever, needed to run through what he called the household account, which was an account with his name on it and hers nowhere to be found. He told her friends they weren't welcome without 48 hours' notice. He told her father, me, that visits worked better with a phone call first. For everyone's comfort. I watched my daughter shrink, month by month, the way people shrink when they've been told one too many times that their instincts can't be trusted. There was one door in that house Derek never touched, and it drove him quietly insane. The detached garage sat 40 feet behind the main house, a heavy timber structure I'd built with my own hands the summer before Emily left for college, back when the property still belonged to me and her mother. I hadn't installed some hardware store deadbolt on that garage. I'd installed a mechanical override system I designed myself for a private collector's panic room. 15 years earlier, adapted down to residential scale as a favor to my late wife, who worried about break-ins on that back road. 3 tumblers, 1 hidden reset pin behind the frame trim, and a master key I'd forged myself in a pattern that existed nowhere else on Earth. When I sold the property to Emily and Derek, the paperwork transferred the house. It never transferred that garage lock, because nobody ever thought to ask, and I never thought to mention it, because why would I? It was just an old habit of a man who built doors for a living. Never leave yourself locked out of anything you loved enough to build. Derek changed every lock in that house except the one lock he couldn't touch because he didn't know it wasn't a normal lock at all. He'd had a locksmith out twice, Emily told me later, both times standing in the driveway staring at that garage like it had personally insulted him. Both times the locksmith left shaking his head, unable to pick a mechanism he'd never encountered before. Derek told Emily it didn't matter, that the garage was just storage, that she had no reason to go poking around out there. He told her that with the particular flatness in his voice that I'd learned over 18 months, meant he was lying with his whole chest. I didn't know yet what was inside that garage. I only knew that a man who controls every door in a house except one will eventually become obsessed with the one he can't control. And I knew, the way you know weather is turning before the sky actually changes, that whatever Derek Cole was hiding out there was the reason my daughter had started flinching at her own phone. It was a Tuesday night in October when Emily called me, and I want to be precise about what I heard, because a father remembers exactly how his child's voice sounds when something has finally cracked all the way through. "Dad," she said, and her voice was already breaking on the single syllable. "Dad, please, don't open the garage. Please don't. Heal. Dad, heal." And then she was crying too hard to finish the sentence, and in the background I heard a door slam somewhere in that house, and a man's voice, low and furious, saying her name like a threat. I did not ask her to explain. When your child calls you crying and begging you not to do the one thing she clearly needs you to do, you don't debate semantics. You move. I told her I was coming. I told her to lock the bedroom door and not open it for anyone but me. Then I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for exactly 4 seconds, doing the math I'd done 1,000 times in 34 years of this work. What does a man protect with that much desperation? And what does he lose the day someone finally gets inside? I keep a bag by my door. Not a gun bag, a work bag. 34 years in this trade teaches you that the real leverage in this world usually isn't a weapon, it's information nobody else can extract. In that bag, a set of pics I hadn't touched in 2 years, a compact borescope camera the size of a fountain pen, a notepad, and a spare copy of that garage's original master key, hands stamped with a pattern I designed myself the year Emily turned 16. I had never told a living soul that spare key existed. Not Derek, not the county records office, not even Emily, because at the time I made it, she was a teenager who didn't need to know her father kept a backup key to every door he'd ever built for the people he loved. That's the whole of what a father does that nobody ever puts in a toast. He builds the doors, and then he keeps the keys nobody else knows to ask about, for exactly the night someone needs him to walk through one. I drove those 40 minutes faster than I should have, and the whole way there, one plain sentence sat in my chest like a stone. My daughter had just told me not to open a door, which meant whatever was behind it she already knew, and she was terrified of what would happen the moment somebody else knew too. The porch light at Emily's house was off when I pulled in, which told me something before I even got out of the truck. Derek Cole liked control, and control means light exactly where he wants it, and darkness everywhere else. I parked at the end of the driveway instead of pulling up close, an old habit from 34 years of not wanting my headlights to announce me before I'd decided what I was walking into. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, and I want to be honest with you about something most men my age don't say out loud on camera. My hands were shaking, not from age, from the particular fear that has nothing to do with your own safety and everything to do with a phone call from your child that ends in tears you can't reach through the receiver to wipe away. I have spent my whole professional life being underestimated. Clients used to laugh when I showed up to bid a vault installation, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with reading glasses and a canvas tool roll instead of a briefcase full of credentials. I let them laugh. Underestimation is the single most useful tool a locksmith owns, more useful than any pick set ever machined. Because a man who thinks you're harmless will hand you the keys to everything he's trying to protect right before you take them apart. Derek Cole had called me old man at his own wife's birthday dinner in front of 12 people, and not once in 18 months had it occurred to him to wonder what a man does for 34 years that leaves him unbothered by being called old. I let him wonder that for one more night. Then I got out of the truck. The kitchen light was on. I could see Emily's silhouette through the window over the sink, standing very still, the way people stand when they're listening for footsteps on stairs. I didn't knock. I'd raised that girl in a house not 2 miles from where I now stood, and some fathers never fully hand over the instinct that tells them exactly which door their own child needs them to walk through without waiting for permission. I went around back, past the rose bed her mother had planted the year before she passed, toward the dark shape of the garage, sitting 40 feet behind the house, like it had been holding its breath for 18 months, waiting for someone who actually knew how to open it. Derek was standing at the garage door when I came around the corner. He had a crowbar in one hand and a locksmith's drill bit adapter in the other. And in the spill of a shop light he'd rigged from an extension cord, I could see he'd already gouged 3 long silver scars into the frame, trying to force the mechanism I'd built to protect exactly this kind of man. He looked up when he heard my boots on the gravel, and for 1/2 of 1 second, something flickered across his face that I recognized instantly, because I'd seen it on the faces of men in interrogation rooms my whole career before I ever knew that's what my career had actually been preparing me for. It was the look of a man who has just realized the walls are smaller than he thought. "You'll never get in there, old man," he said, but his voice had not lost the smooth real estate polish it usually carried. It cracked right down the middle of old man, the same 2 words he'd used to shut me up at that dinner table 8 months earlier, except this time they came out like a plea instead of an insult. Behind him, through the gap where he'd pried the frame, I could just make out the edge of something under a canvas tarp, something large and rectangular that didn't belong in a family's storage garage. Something that made the muscles in my jaw lock tight before my brain had even finished the thought. I looked at that ruined door frame, 3 deep gouges from a crowbar wielded by a man who'd spent 2 years failing to understand a mechanism he'd never bothered to ask about, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt since the day I closed my business. Not anger. Exactly, certainty. I reached into my jacket pocket and closed my hand around a key that had been waiting 18 months for a night exactly like this one. "Derek," I said, and I made sure my voice carried the same flat calm I used to use on men who thought a locked door meant they were finally safe. "You've been trying to break into a lock I built for your wife's mother 15 years before you ever walked into this family. You want to know why you couldn't get through it in 2 years with a drill and a crowbar?" He didn't answer. He just stood there gripping that crowbar like it was still going to save him. I held up the key and let the shop light catch the pattern stamped into its shoulder, a pattern that existed nowhere else on this earth except in my own workshop and in the tumblers of that exact lock. "Because you were never the man with the key," I told him. "You were just the man standing in front of a door, hoping nobody who actually built it would ever come home." Behind me, I heard the back door of the house open, and Emily's voice, small and disbelieving, calling my name into the dark. I didn't turn around yet. I kept my eyes on Derek Cole, on the way his hand had started trembling around that crowbar, on the way a man who'd spent 18 months making my daughter feel 2 inches tall now looked like he wanted to fold himself down to nothing and disappear into the gravel. I slid the key into the lock he'd never once thought to ask about, and I felt the 3 tumblers turn exactly the way I'd built them to turn 15 years ago, smooth and certain, like the door had simply been waiting the whole time for its own maker to finally come home. The mechanism gave with a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. 3 soft clicks, one after another, the sound of 15-year-old steel remembering exactly whose hand it was built to answer to. The heavy timber door swung inward on hinges. I'd oiled myself the summer Emily left for college, and the shop light Derek had rigged through a long yellow rectangle across a garage floor I hadn't stood on in almost 2 years. Derek didn't move to stop me. He just stood there in the gravel with that crowbar hanging useless at his side, watching a 61-year-old man he'd called old man at a birthday dinner walk through a door he himself had spent 2 years and 3 separate locksmiths trying to force open. Emily reached me before I'd taken 3 steps inside. She threw her arms around my chest from behind, still crying, her whole body shaking, and she kept saying the same 4 words into the back of my jacket. Dad, don't. Please don't. I turned around and held her by both shoulders, and I looked at my daughter's face in that spilled yellow light, and I saw something I hadn't let myself fully see in 18 months of 40-minute drives and phone calls that ended too quickly and birthday dinners where I sat down and shut up, because that's what a father does when he's trying not to make things worse. I saw fear, not fear of Derek finding out what was in that garage, fear of what I would do once I knew. Emily, I said, keeping my voice as level and quiet as I'd once kept it in rooms where a wrong tone could cost a man his composure and his confession both. Look at me. Whatever is under that tarp, I am not going to let it hurt you. But I need you to tell me right now. Do you already know what's in there? She didn't answer with words. She just nodded, once, and the way her whole face crumpled when she did it told me everything I needed to know about how long she'd been carrying this alone. How many nights she'd lain awake in that house, 2 miles from mine, knowing something was wrong in her own garage and having absolutely no one she felt safe enough to tell. Behind her, Derek had finally found his voice again, and it came out high and fast in a way that stripped away every ounce of real estate charm I'd watched him perform at 100 family gatherings. Walter, wait, he said, and it was the first time in 18 months he'd used my actual name instead of old man. You don't understand what you're looking at. Just let me explain before you. I let go of Emily's shoulders, gently, and I turned back toward that open garage door, toward the long canvas-wrapped shape, sitting under the shop light like it had been waiting 2 years for someone who actually knew how to look at it properly. I want you to understand something about the 34 years I spent building locks for people who had good reason to be afraid. You learn, eventually, that the door itself is never the real story. The door is just the last thing standing between a family and the truth somebody decided they weren't allowed to have. I had just opened the door. Whatever was under that tarp was about to become a story. Derek Cole could no longer control. No matter how many locksmiths he hired, no matter how many crowbars he swung, no matter how many times he ever again looked at me and decided I was just some old man who didn't understand what he was looking at. I understood exactly what I was looking at. I had built the only lock in that house he'd never managed to break, and I had just walked through it, and somewhere behind me in the dark, my daughter had finally stopped being afraid to let me see what she'd been protecting me from for 18 silent months. I stepped toward the tarp, reached out one steady hand, and took hold of the edge of the canvas. The canvas came away easier than I expected, sliding off in one long pull that raised a small storm of dust into the shop light. What sat underneath wasn't a body, and it wasn't a weapon, and for one strange half-second I felt something close to relief before my eyes finished adjusting to what I was actually looking at. It was a car, a 1967 Shelby Mustang, deep British racing green, the kind of machine that doesn't belong parked in a suburban garage under a tarp. It belongs in a glass showroom with a velvet rope around it. The paint was flawless. Somebody had spent real money keeping this car in a condition most collectors only dream about. I stood there for a moment longer than I meant to, because something about the shape of that car reached into a part of my chest I keep locked tighter than any door I ever built. My late wife, Carol, had loved a car almost exactly like this one. Not this one, I want to be clear, but close enough in silhouette and color that for one disorienting second, the garage light and the smell of old motor oil pulled me 30 years backward into a Sunday afternoon that no longer existed anywhere except inside me. My hand, the one still holding the master key, started to shake. Not from fear. From something older and quieter that 34 years of professional composure has never fully managed to lock away. I had to put my other palm flat against the door frame and breathe through it for a second before I could keep moving. Emily saw it. She didn't say anything, but her hand found my shoulder. and for just a moment our roles reversed, and it was my daughter steadying me instead of the other way around. "Dad," she said quietly, "that's not why I was scared." I nodded because I believed her, and I made myself walk the rest of the way into that garage. Up close, the illusion of a simple vintage restoration fell apart fast, the way most illusions do once you know exactly where to look. The VIN plate riveted under the hood had been filed at one corner, not enough to erase it entirely, but enough to make a quick glance useless and a careful one deliberate. There was a second older plate spot welded beneath the first, half covered in fresh undercoating that hadn't fully cured. Somebody had layered a false identity directly over a real one, the automotive equivalent of forging a signature. 34 years of reading tamper marks on locks had taught me exactly what tampering looks like when somebody's trying to make an old truth disappear under a new one. Derek had followed us in from the driveway, the crowbar finally hanging loose and forgotten at his side. He stood near the door with the particular stillness of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in real time, and unable to find a single beam still worth holding up. "It's not what you think," he said, which is, in my experience, the sentence men say roughly one breath before confirming it's exactly what you think. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice level, "I spent 3 decades installing security systems for people who owned cars worth more than this house. I know what a re-stamped VIN looks like. I know what fresh undercoat over old rust looks like. And I know that a man doesn't hide a legally purchased collector car behind 3 tumblers designed to stop a professional." I crouched by the front wheel well and ran 2 fingers along a seam in the paint that didn't quite match the panel beside it. Somebody repainted this fast. Somebody who needed it to stop looking like whatever it looked like before. Emily's voice came from behind me, thin and steady in the way people get when they've finally decided to stop protecting someone who never deserved the protection. "It's Mr. Holloway's car," she said. Derek's head snapped toward her so fast, the shop light caught the sweat along his hairline. "Emily." "No," she said, and for the first time in 18 months I heard my daughter's real voice. The one I remembered from before she married this man, cut clean through his interruption without flinching. "You've made me carry this alone for 4 months, Derek. I'm done." Arthur Holloway. She told us, an 83-year-old widower who'd been one of Derek's real estate clients 2 years earlier, a man with no children, a modest fortune, and a garage full of pre-war and mid-century automobiles he'd collected across 60 years of careful, quiet devotion. Derek had helped him downsize from a 5-bedroom colonial into a retirement community, handling not just the property sale, but, at Mr. Holloway's trusting request, some of the paperwork side of things too. Somewhere inside that phrase, paperwork side of things, an entire man's estate had begun quietly bleeding out of his own control and into accounts with Derek Cole's name attached. I want to be careful here about exactly how I learned the rest, because getting this part right matters more than any other part of this story. I did not hack into anything. I did not break into any account, any email, any locked filing cabinet belonging to a man I'd never met. What happened is simpler and, frankly, more damning, because it means Derek Cole built his own downfall with his own hands, the way careless men always do. Inside the Mustang's glove compartment, unlocked, sitting in plain view the moment I opened it, was a manila folder Derek himself had apparently forgotten was still in the car, printed copies of a trust amendment bearing Arthur Holloway's signature, a signature that, when I held it up beside a birthday card Emily still had from Mr. Holloway congratulating her on the wedding, didn't match in a dozen small ways any forger in a hurry always misses. Beneath that folder sat something else. A small, cracked leather notebook, the kind older men used to carry before phones existed, filled front to back in a shaking, careful hand that was unmistakably not Derek's. I lifted it out slowly, the way you handle anything that might be the one true thing in a room full of lies. The last entry, dated 11 days before Emily's frightened phone call, reads simply, "I don't understand these new papers Derek brought me. He says it's just for tax purposes. I trust him because Emily trusts him." I hope that's enough. I stood in that garage holding an old man's handwritten worry in my palm, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. The particular calm I used to feel the moment a job stopped being theoretical and became personal. Derek Cole hadn't just been controlling my daughter for 18 months. He'd been quietly dismantling an elderly, trusting widower's entire life's collection, laundering pieces of it through a stolen car parked 40 feet behind his own dinner table, in a garage locked with a mechanism built by the one man in his life he decided wasn't worth respecting. "Where is Mr. Holloway now?" I asked, and I heard my own voice drop into a register I hadn't used since the day I closed my business, flat and precise and entirely without room for negotiation. Derek's composure finally cracked all the way through. "He's fine," he said, too fast. "He's at Riverside Commons. Walter, listen to me. I never hurt him. I would never—" "You forged his signature on a trust amendment," I said. "You retitled a stolen vehicle in a false VIN and hid it behind a lock you spent 2 years trying to break, because you knew exactly what would happen the day the man who built it walked in here. That's not paperwork, Derek. That's elder financial abuse and grand theft auto. And somewhere in the last 4 months, my daughter figured out enough of it to start crying every time you raised your voice." He looked at Emily then, and something genuinely desperate crossed his face. The first honest thing I'd seen from him in 18 months. I did this for us. The market's been brutal. The commission side dried up. And Renner offered. It was just supposed to be a bridge, one deal, and then I'd fix it before anyone. Renner, I repeated. Derek's jaw locked shut so fast I heard his teeth click. "I want to tell you that I recognized the name instantly through some dramatic feat of memory, but the truth is simpler and closer to how real information actually moves through the world. 2 summers earlier, a former client of mine, a retired appraiser I'd installed a safe room for, a man named Kurt, who still called me twice a year just to talk shop, had mentioned over coffee that the county had opened an inquiry into a private lender named Salvatore Renner, a man who financed struggling businessmen at brutal interest through collateral. Nobody was supposed to ask too many questions about collateral that had a way of turning out to be stolen. Kurt wasn't a cop, he wasn't a source. He was a retired professional who'd heard something at a hobbyist car show and passed it along the way old men in small industries always do, because everybody in a small trade eventually hears the same handful of names. I hadn't thought about that conversation in 2 years. Standing in that garage with a forged trust document in one hand and a stolen Mustang's registration in the other, I thought about it very clearly indeed. "You owe Renner money," I said. It wasn't a question Derek didn't answer, which was its own answer. Emily made a small broken sound behind me, and when I turned, I saw the last piece of 18 months finally land on her all at once. Not just that her husband had lied to her, but that he had lied to her using the memory of a lonely, trusting old man who probably still thought of Derek Cole as the nice young agent who'd helped him find a smaller place, close to the grandchildren he never got to visit enough. "I need you to understand something, Derek," I said. And I crouched down so I was eye level with him, where he'd half collapsed onto the garage's workbench stool, because 34 years of reading frightened men taught me that the ones who are truly starting to break need to be looked at directly, not shouted at from above. I am not the police. I am not a lawyer. I am a 61-year-old man who spent his whole career making sure the wrong people never got through the wrong doors. Tonight you are going to learn exactly how good I was at my job." He laughed, but it came out cracked and hollow. Nothing like the smooth confidence I remembered from that birthday dinner. "You're going to what, old man? Call the cops on your own daughter's husband? Drag her through that? You think Renner just walks away quietly when his collateral gets flagged? You have no idea what you're about to open up." It was the second time that night he'd called me old man, and this time it didn't land the way he intended. It landed the way a locked door lands against a man who's finally realized he never had the only key he thought he did. "I built vault systems for men who made your Renner look like a parking meter thief," I said quietly. "I have spent 34 years learning exactly how careful men protect the things that actually matter to them. You want to know the difference between you and every dangerous man I ever met in this line of work. Every one of them respected a locked door. You spent 2 years trying to break one open with a crowbar, because you never once considered that the quiet old man at the dinner table might be the most dangerous person in the room. Behind me, Emily had gone very still, staring down at her own hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the flat exhaustion of someone setting down a weight she'd been carrying alone for far too long. "There's something else," she said. "I found bank statements 3 weeks ago. He's been moving money out of my mother's trust into the household account since February. I didn't say anything because I was scared of what he'd do if he knew I'd seen them, and I was scared of what would happen to Mr. Halloway if I told anyone before I understood the whole thing. I stood up slowly, and I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, past the flinch and the exhaustion and the 18 months of shrinking herself smaller and smaller in her own house, and I saw, underneath all of it, the same girl who used to sit on my workbench stool as a teenager and hand me tools before I even asked for them, patient and sharp, and entirely unwilling to let a problem stay unsolved once she understood its shape. That girl hadn't disappeared. She'd just been quietly building her own case in silence, the same way I would have, because some things really do run in the blood, whether you teach them on purpose or not. "You did the hardest part already," I told her. "You started paying attention when it would have been easier not to. Now let me help you finish it properly, so it holds up, so nobody can twist it back around on you or on Mr. Halloway later." I turned back to Derek, who hadn't moved from that stool, his whole posture folding smaller by the second. "Here's what's going to happen tonight. You're not going anywhere near this garage, this house, or Arthur Halloway until I say otherwise. Emily is going to gather every document you've touched of her mother's trust. And you," I said, and I let a beat of silence sit there long enough for him to feel exactly how little room he had left to negotiate, "are going to start hoping I decide to bring this to a lawyer before I decide to bring it to whoever Renner actually is. I have spent 34 years watching people underestimate a quiet man with steady hands. Derek Cole had done it at a birthday dinner in front of 12 witnesses, calling me old man like it settled something, standing in that garage at midnight holding a dead man's— no, not dead, I reminded myself, an old and vulnerable man's— handwritten worry in one hand and his stolen car's forged paperwork in the other. I finally understood exactly what my daughter had been trying to protect me from when she begged me not to open that door. She wasn't protecting Derek. She was terrified of what her father, once he finally saw the whole shape of it, would be capable of doing about it. She didn't know yet that the answer wasn't going to be violence. It was going to be patience, the same patience that had let me build locks nobody could break for 3.5 decades. I looked down at Derek Cole one more time, sitting small and unraveling on a stool in a garage he'd never once managed to properly own, and I said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. "I didn't know it yet," I told Emily later that night, sitting at her kitchen table with Mr. Halloway's leather notebook between us, the faucet finally shut off, the house finally quiet in a way it hadn't been in 18 months. But that garage door was never really about a car. By 7 the next morning I hadn't slept, and I didn't need to. 34 years in this business teaches a man that the hours right after a door finally opens are the hours that matter most. Not because of what you already know, but because of how fast the people who were counting on that door staying shut start scrambling to build a new one. I sat at Emily's kitchen table with Mr. Halloway's cracked leather notebook, the forged trust amendment, and 3 years of bank statements Emily had pulled from a shoebox. Derek didn't know she'd found, and I did what I've always done best. I read the paper trail the way other men read a room. Derek hadn't left the house. I'd made that clear the night before, standing in the garage with a stolen Shelby Mustang between us and a dead man's, an old man's. I corrected myself again, because Arthur Halloway was very much alive, and that distinction mattered more than anything else in that whole ugly business. Worry sitting open on the workbench. Derek had spent the night on the living room couch, and every hour or so I heard the floor creak as he paced, the sound of a man doing math that no longer added up in his favor no matter how many times he ran it. Emily made coffee at 6, her hands steadier than they'd been in months, and set a cup down in front of me without asking how I took it, because some things a daughter never forgets about her father, even after 18 months of being told her instincts couldn't be trusted. "What happens now?" she asked. And I heard, underneath the exhaustion, the particular hope of someone who has just remembered she isn't actually alone in this. "I want to tell you honestly that I thought about calling the police first. I want to tell you I thought about driving straight to Riverside Commons and demanding to see Arthur Halloway myself, badge or no badge, 34 years of professional habit or not. But I've spent my whole career watching amateurs move too fast and lose everything because they let their anger outrun their evidence. A locked door doesn't care how furious you are standing outside it. It only cares whether you actually understand the mechanism. We build the case first," I told her, "properly, so that when it lands once, and it lands so hard nobody can talk their way back out of it." I made 2 calls that morning. The first was to Simone Okafor, a forensic accountant I'd worked alongside years earlier on a vault installation for a private trust company, a woman with the kind of patient, exacting mind that makes lawyers nervous and defrauders sweat. I didn't ask her to hack anything, and she wouldn't have agreed if I had. I asked her to look at exactly what Emily had already lawfully found. 3 years of statements pulled from a shoebox in her own home, a folder Derek himself had left sitting unlocked in a car he owned the title to, however falsely, and tell me whether it painted the picture I thought it did. She called back 40 minutes later with a voice flatter and colder than I'd ever heard from her. "Walter," she said, "this isn't sloppy fraud. This is a man who's been bleeding an old man's trust for the better part of a year to service a debt he can't pay off any other way. I count at least 4 transfers that never should have cleared without a co-trustee signature. Your daughter's mother's name is on that trust as the original grantor. Emily is listed as successor trustee. She has every legal right to freeze what's left of it this morning, without asking anyone's permission." The second call was harder. I dialed the direct line for Detective Marla Reyes, a woman I'd known for almost 20 years, ever since I'd installed the evidence vault at the county sheriff's substation, and she'd been the young officer standing guard while I worked. She'd made detective 11 years ago, and had a reputation, among people who mattered, for being the rare kind of investigator who moved carefully enough that her cases actually held up in court instead of collapsing under their own excitement. "Marla," I said, "I need you to hear something out before you decide what kind of call this is." I told her everything, plainly, in the order I'd learned it. The garage, the car, the forged signature, the notebook, the shoebox of statements Emily had found lawfully in her own home, the name Renner that had made Derek's jaw lock shut like a bank vault. Marla was quiet for a long moment on the other end. "Walter," she finally said, "if even half of what you're describing checks out, this isn't just financial fraud. That Mustang's VIN, if it's re-stamped over a real one, that's a stolen vehicle that likely crossed state lines to get laundered clean. Renner's been on our radar for 18 months on exactly that kind of collateral scheme. You just handed me the first piece of physical evidence anyone's actually managed to put a hand on." "I'm not handing you anything yet," I said. "I want Arthur Halloway safe and informed first. I want a lawyer reviewing that trust amendment before anyone kicks in a door and lets Renner's people find out their collateral just got flagged. Do this carefully, Marla. My daughter's name is on paperwork Derek forged without her knowledge. I need her protected in this, not caught in the middle of it." "Understood," she said. "Give me until this afternoon. I'll have someone from Elder Justice sit with Halloway quietly, no uniforms, no alarm, and Walter, good work. I mean that. I hadn't expected those 3 words to land the way they did. 34 years of being the quiet man in the room, the one clients underestimated right up until the moment their vault held against everything thrown at it, and it still meant something to hear a detective I respected say good work out loud. I didn't let myself sit with it long. There was still a house full of unfinished business, and a man on my daughter's couch who thought his biggest problem was still an old locksmith with a spare key. By 10 that morning, Simone had drafted the paperwork for Emily to formally freeze the remaining trust assets as successor trustee, a document Emily signed at her own kitchen table with a hand that barely shook at all. a marked difference from the hand that had held a phone to her ear the night before, begging me not to open a door. Derek sat across the room the entire time, watching his wife dismantle, piece by legal piece, the structure he'd spent a year quietly building on top of a trusting old man's generosity. He didn't argue. There's a particular silence men fall into once they finally understand that the ground beneath them was never as solid as they'd convinced themselves it was, and Derek Cole wore that silence like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. "I want to see Arthur," Emily said, once the paperwork was signed and witnessed. "Today. I need to look him in the eye and tell him I didn't know, and I need to hear that he's really all right." I drove her myself. Riverside Commons sat on a quiet street lined with maples just beginning to turn, and Arthur Halloway met us in the small sitting room off the main lobby. A thin, careful man of 83 in a cardigan the color of weak tea, with the particular alertness of someone who has spent his whole life being sharper than people gave him credit for. When Emily told him what she'd found, gently, plainly, the way I'd have told a client whose vault had been compromised, his face didn't collapse the way I expected. It hardened, I wondered. He said quietly, folding his hands in his lap. "Derek came by 3 weeks ago, with papers, he said, needed my signature for tax purposes. My late wife used to say a man who won't let you read something slowly is usually hoping you won't read it at all. I signed it anyway. I trusted him because he was your husband, Emily, and I trusted you." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face softened even as his voice stayed steady. "That trust wasn't wrong. It's the man who broke it." He reached into the drawer of a small side table and pulled out a folder of his own, copies of the same amended trust documents, kept, he told us, because an old man who's outlived 2 business partners and a wife learns to keep his own copies of everything, no matter how much he trusts the person handing him the pen. His copies matched what I'd found in the garage exactly, down to the same subtly wrong signature. It was, Simone told me later, exactly the kind of independently sourced corroboration that turns a family's suspicion into a prosecutor's case. I want to pause here and tell you something I don't say often because 34 years of professional composure doesn't leave a lot of room for it. Sitting in that small sitting room, watching my daughter hold an old man's hand while he told her, gently, that none of this was her fault, I thought about my late wife, Carol, and the year before she passed, when I sat by a hospital bed and felt, for the first time in my adult life, entirely unable to fix the door in front of me, no matter how many tools I owned. I have spent my whole career being the man other people call when something feels unbreakable. I could not save Carol. I have carried that failure quietly for 6 years, in a place I don't open for just anyone. Sitting across from Arthur Halloway, I understood, maybe for the first time, that some doors you can't fix by force or patience. You can only make sure the people you love aren't left standing in front of them alone. That was the door I could still walk through for Emily. I intended to. We left Riverside Commons a little after noon, and Marla called before we'd even reached the truck. "Elder Justice Unit is with Halloway's file now," she said. "And Walter, we pulled the Mustang's real VIN off the underlayer this morning with a forensic tech. It matches a vehicle reported stolen out of a private collection 18 months ago in the next county. Over. Owner's insurance company has been quietly investigating for over a year. This just became a lot bigger than one bad son-in-law." "How much bigger?" I asked. "Big enough," she said, "that I think you should brace your daughter for what's coming next. We're not just talking about Derek anymore." I looked over at Emily in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the maples going gold along Riverside Commons' quiet street, her hands finally still in her lap for the first time in 18 months. I didn't know it yet, but the name Renner was about to become a great deal more than a debt Derek Cole owed to a dangerous man. It was about to become the reason a locked garage door built by a retired locksmith turned into the center of a case that would, within 72 hours, pull federal attention into a small town that had never once needed it before. Emily reached over and took my hand off the gear shift, the way she used to as a little girl in the passenger seat of my old truck. Back before any of this, back when the only lock either of us worried about was the one on her bicycle. "Thank you for not asking me to explain everything last night," she said quietly. "I don't think I could have. You didn't need to, I told her. You called me. That was enough. I drove her home in silence after that, and somewhere behind us, 40 minutes back down that familiar road, sat a garage I'd built with my own hands 15 years earlier. A door I'd never expected to open again, and a man on my daughter's couch who was about to learn exactly how much further this was going to go before it was finally completely over. We didn't have to wait long for Renner to make his presence known. 2 nights after Marla told me the case had grown bigger than one bad son-in-law, a black sedan idled at the end of Emily's street for the better part of an hour before I noticed it from her front window. Engine running, no lights. The particular stillness of men who know exactly how to wait without looking like they're waiting. 34 years of installing security systems for people who had good reason to be nervous teaches you to recognize that stillness on sight. I called Marla before I called anyone else. Don't approach it, she said. I'll have a unit swing the block. But Walter, this tells me Renner already knows his collateral got flagged. Men like that don't send a car to idle outside a house for no reason. They're testing whether anyone's watching. Derek had moved back into a spare room by then, under an arrangement Emily and I had settled between us that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with keeping him where I could see him until the paperwork caught up with the truth. When I told him about the sedan, something in his face went the color of old paper. That's them, he said, and for the first time since the garage, his voice had lost every trace of the man who once told me to sit down at his own wife's birthday dinner. Walter, you don't understand. Renner doesn't send warnings. He sends collections. Then you're going to tell me everything, I said, right now, in a way that gives Detective Reyes something she can actually use. Or I promise you the next conversation you have won't be with me. What came out of Derek over the following hour wasn't a confession delivered with dignity. It was the unraveling of a frightened, cornered man who'd made one desperate decision 18 months earlier and then spent every month since trying to outrun the shape of it. He'd borrowed $60,000 from Salvatore Renner to cover a real estate deal that collapsed the week after closing, a deal he'd never told Emily about because admitting failure, I was beginning to understand, was the one thing Derek Cole feared more than any locked door I'd ever built. Renner didn't take collateral in cash. He took it in things men were too proud to admit they'd lose. A stolen Mustang funneled through a shell buyer, an old man's trust, quietly drained a little at a time to keep the interest payments current, a marriage slowly hollowed out by a husband, too ashamed to say the word bankrupt out loud to the woman who'd trusted him with her mother's memory. I was going to fix it, Derek said, and I watched something genuinely break in him as he said it, the particular collapse of a man realizing, out loud for the first time, exactly how far a small lie can travel before it stops being small. I kept telling myself one more month, one more deal, and I'd move the money back before anyone noticed. I never meant for it to get this far. I have spent 34 years listening to men explain with real conviction exactly how a small compromise became an unrecognizable ruin. I no longer find the explanation particularly interesting. What I found interesting, sitting at my daughter's kitchen table with a stolen car's forged papers still spread between us, was that Derek Cole, a man who had spent 18 months making my daughter feel small, who had called me old man in front of 12 witnesses, who had drained a lonely widower's trust to service a debt to a dangerous stranger, was, underneath all of it, exactly as frightened and small as he had once tried to make Emily feel. That didn't earn him forgiveness. It earned him, at most, my willingness to let the law finish what he'd started, instead of finishing it myself in that garage, the night I found him with a crowbar in his hand. Marla's unit picked up 2 men from the sedan, 3 blocks away the following morning, both carrying no weapons but plenty of documentation connecting them to a private lending operation under active federal investigation. The same investigation. It turned out that my old client Kurt had once mentioned to me over coffee 2 summers earlier, without either of us knowing it would ever matter. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, already circling Renner's operation for 18 months, had been missing exactly one piece to move, a single, clean, physically traceable item of stolen collateral they could tie directly to a specific loan and a specific debtor. Derek Cole, without ever intending to, had handed them that piece the moment he hid a re-stamped Shelby Mustang behind a lock he never managed to break. I want to be honest that the weeks that followed were not the tidy, satisfying unraveling you see in the stories people tell at dinner parties. There were subpoenas. There were long, exhausting afternoons with lawyers, both Emily's and Arthur Halloway's, going over trust documents line by line. There was a federal agent named Whitfield, dry and thorough, who interviewed me twice about the timeline of that garage and made very clear, both times, that my role as a private citizen who'd simply opened his own lawfully built lock and lawfully found paperwork sitting in plain view was exactly the kind of clean, defensible discovery that made a defense attorney's job considerably harder. Renner was indicted 6 weeks later on racketeering and grand theft charges spanning 3 counties. Derek pled guilty to fraud and elder financial exploitation rather than risk a trial that would have connected him more deeply to Renner's larger operation, and was sentenced to 4 years, with restitution ordered to both Arthur Halloway's estate and Emily's mother's trust. None of that, though, is the part of this story I actually want to end on, because a man's punishment was never the point of opening that door. The point was always my daughter, and the particular moment 3 months after that October night, when she finally stopped flinching at the sound of a car pulling into her own driveway. Arthur Halloway insisted on hosting a small gathering that spring once the restitution had cleared and the trust had been fully restored under Emily's careful management as successor trustee. Nothing extravagant, he said. Just a chance to properly thank the people who'd stood up for him when he was too far from his own family to know he needed standing up for. He held it in the community room at Riverside Commons, folding chairs and a sheet cake and a handful of residents who'd become fond of Emily over her visits in the months since. I hadn't expected to be asked to say anything. I've spent my whole career being the man in the background, the one who builds the door and steps away before anyone thinks to thank him for it. But Arthur stood up first, in his cardigan the color of weak tea, and in a voice steadier than I'd heard from him since that first afternoon in the sitting room, he said something I have thought about nearly every day since. "I want to tell you all something about locks," he said, and I felt Emily's hand find mine under the folding table. For 83 years I thought the point of a lock was to keep the wrong people out. I've learned, this past year, that the real point of a good lock is much simpler than that. It's to make sure that when the people who actually love you finally come looking, there's still something left standing for them to find. He looked at me directly then, in front of that small room of strangers and neighbors and one very quiet daughter, and he said, "Walter Briggs built a door 15 years ago for a family he loved, never once imagining he'd need to walk through it himself one day to save 2 families instead of 1. I don't think there's a finer thing a man can spend his life learning how to do." I didn't trust my voice enough to answer him properly. I just nodded, and I felt Emily's hand tighten around mine, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I let myself sit in a room full of people and simply be seen for exactly what I was, instead of quietly disappearing into the background, the way I'd trained myself to do across 34 years of building things other people got to be proud of in public. Later that afternoon, once the cake had been cut and the folding chairs had emptied out, Emily and I sat together on a bench outside Riverside Commons, watching the maples that had been just turning gold the day we'd first come here now fully green with early summer. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to actually hear it, not just fix it, because I know that's what you do." I told her I was listening. "I stayed too long," she said. "I saw the locks change. I saw the account. I saw the way he talked to you at my own birthday dinner, and some part of me knew, months before that phone call, that something was badly wrong. I didn't call you sooner because I was ashamed. I thought admitting it meant admitting I'd made a mistake choosing him, and I didn't want you to have to carry that for me on top of everything else you already carry alone since Mom." Her voice caught on the last word, and I felt my own throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. "I should have called you the week the locks changed, not the night I was standing in my own kitchen listening to him try to break into a garage." I didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't, And 34 years of reading rooms had taught me that the people you love deserve the truth more than they deserve comfort, dressed up as reassurance. You're right, I said. You should have called sooner. And I should have said something the night he told me to sit down at your birthday dinner, instead of quietly filing it away and telling myself I was being patient. I've spent a lot of years being good at building doors for other people's problems, and not nearly enough years being good at walking through the ones sitting right in front of my own family. We both let this go on longer than it should have. I don't think either of us needs to carry that alone anymore. She leaned her head against my shoulder then, the way she used to as a little girl, waiting outside my workshop for me to finish a job. And for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, just sat there together in the early summer light, listening to somebody's grandchildren laughing on the lawn behind us. I drove back out to that garage one more time before the summer ended, alone on a quiet Tuesday evening with the sun going long and gold across the gravel driveway I'd once parked a much younger version of myself in front of. 30 years earlier, the summer I built that door for a family I loved and never once imagined I'd have to walk through it again to save that same family from someone else. The Mustang was long gone, returned at last to its rightful owner 2 counties over, a man who'd sent me, unprompted, a handwritten letter, thanking a stranger he'd never met for a diligence he said he could hardly believe still existed in the world. Renner's case was working its way slowly through federal court. Derek was 4 states away by then, in a facility I never once visited and never intended to. I stood in front of that empty garage in the last of the evening light, ran my thumb over the same 3 tumblers I'd machined by hand 15 years earlier, and I thought about something I hadn't let myself think clearly since the night Emily called me crying and begged me not to open that door. I thought about how a lock at the end of everything was never really about keeping people out at all. It was about making absolutely certain that when the person who loved you enough came looking, there would still be a way through, no matter how many years had passed, no matter how many other hands had tried and failed in between. I had built that door for a wife I lost too soon and a daughter I nearly lost to my own quiet patience. It had held exactly long enough for both of them. I locked it once more, out of old habit more than necessity, and I drove home in the dark with the windows down, the whole way thinking about the particular kind of strength that never needs to raise its voice to prove it's still standing guard. Derek Cole had spent 18 months believing that control meant changing every lock in a house until nobody else had a way in. I had spent 34 years learning that real protection was never about how many doors you could shut. It was about which one door you built carefully enough and loved someone enough to still be holding the only key to, however many years later the night finally came when she needed you to use it. If you've made it this far, and something in this story reminded you of your own family, your own quiet instincts, you talked yourself out of trusting, I hope you'll remember what Arthur Halloway told that small room in his cardigan the color of weak tea. The point was never keeping the world out. It was making sure that when the people who love you finally come looking, there's still something left standing for them to find.